And it wasn't a day or so later I came across your article, Can Superintendent's Evaluation Lead to Their Own Growth? And in the article, you point out the unintended consequences of a traditional school board process of evaluation, how often they occur, or often that they're unclear, both in the terms of what's being evaluated, in terms of timelines and things like that. And, just how like even lowering 1 point could accelerate a superintendent's departure. And so you reference the incredibly disturbing national trend when it comes to leader longevity, right? We're losing superintendents at alarming rates. And as one continues to read the article, she learns more about the shared process that you created with your board in Madison, Wisconsin, which included self-reflection. So I know those who are listening today are thinking, are you going to ask her a question or are you just going to talk? So here's my question. Now in your role at Harvard, you have an opportunity to advise and mentor superintendents. And so I wonder, would you take a moment and just describe the advice that you give them when it comes to the evaluation process?
Absolutely, Peter. The advice that I mostly pass on is advice that was given to me when I first became a superintendent and was seeking advice. And that was to keep your hands on the steering wheel of your evaluation process, which seems like especially pertinent advice now, given that things are so precarious, and especially if you're leading for equity in today's climate. But that said, yes, evaluation processes do need to be designed to be protective, but they also need to be developmental, right? They should support our growth as leaders, and they ought to be relational. If done well, they can build stronger relationships between superintendents and their boards, superintendents and their teams, even superintendents and their communities. So there are a few lessons that I highlight in that article, which I'll just maybe quickly summarize. So the first one is that it's crucial to use every step of your evaluation process to help your board understand the breadth and the depth of the superintendent's job, right? Not just once, like in the beginning, but ongoingly. And that's because you need them to help you do your best work. And if they don't understand the job in relationship to the charge that they've given you, it's hard for them to do so. So from like the competencies you choose that you're evaluated on, to the evidence that you may compile in alignment with those competencies, to the self-reflection you might submit to your board. In my mind, every step of that process ought to provide an opportunity to support your board in gaining a deeper understanding of the job and the conditions necessary to do the job well. So number one, teach a board about the job that you do. Most of them did not run because they were interested in managing the superintendent, right? They ran on other subjects. So they do need to be supported in that process. The second thing is that evaluations often involve gaining feedback from direct reports and from stakeholders. I know I often, every year for years, I used a survey tool for principals and direct reports. I think it's really crucial to build in reflective time to make sense of that 360 feedback. And that includes processing that feedback with others, but not necessarily processing it with your board. I don't think that's the group that you ought to be processing with. You don't, in my mind, want to hand over survey results to your board without having interpreted them, right? Really prepared to tell them what you think they mean, what the implications are for your leadership. So the opportunity to take stock of the positive feedback you'll hopefully get in a tool like that, but also the more challenging critical feedback is something you ought to do on your own, right? Kind of quiet reflection time. It might be something you do with a coach, right? Which can be really powerful and supportive. And it can be more powerful when you're processing it with the people who gave you the feedback. So you can better understand where it came from. So there's that. And then I would say finally, it's important to diminish the public nature of the evaluation. It can be scary. Superintendent evaluations are often, in the newspaper, publicly available for other people to read. And I think you can diminish the public nature of the evaluation by regularly communicating in multiple forms already what you're doing, with what results, and what you're learning along the way. Like the act of sharing what you're learning, it's pretty rare, I think, in leadership. But it builds public trust, it builds credibility, and it makes the evaluation kind of like a blip on the radar screen, right? It can also help if the board suddenly turns on you, meaning, right, there's already a narrative out there. And it increases the likelihood that your community will come to your defense.
Well, you're specifically also, I think, speaking to the fact that boards are not static, so they're dynamic, and so then all of a sudden, the people that hired you, 4 or 5 years down the road, there only may be two that remain, and so all of a sudden, individuals who now are running, who now are saying, "Well, I'm going to evaluate her." If you've been really intentional about speaking to what you've learned, what they've been evaluating you on, and being able to be very public with that, they have no choice but to understand as they enter the job that you've been really clear about what your goals have been.
No question. In fact, I would add that if you haven't already done this, like built into your contract ought to be some language about how the superintendent gets to design the evaluation process with the board so that you have some say and therefore can build it so that it's protective, developmental, and relational.
That's really interesting. I don't think I've ever seen a contract that includes that. And it's so easy to do. Why? It costs them nothing to say, we're going to develop this collaboratively. Of course, they want somebody that they're going to partner with. That's really smart. I was thinking about your first rule or first piece of advice. And I can remember that when I first became superintendent, no one had advised me on just choose 3 items that you're working on. And so I had, 7 board members. They all had 3 goals that they wanted me to work on, and you're just chasing goals. And so it wasn't until year 2, I believe, that working with our school board association was, whoa, let's pull back and let's choose 3 things that we want him to work on. Of course, he's going to work on all these other areas, but what do you want to evaluate him on, and do that together?
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah. And I would tell you the second piece, and then I'll leave it to I'm really curious on your thoughts. Knowing that your board members don't always interpret information the same way. And so initially I produced a scorecard, sort of almost like a Baldrige sort of scorecard that compared myself to other districts and that kind of thing. And that served maybe 3 members of the board who really like to look at numbers. And then others on the board, the other 4 members, really preferred a narrative. So I had to learn over time to really make a sort of hybrid approach to sharing this information, not unlike you would do with your own students in a classroom or your own teachers in a building if you're a principal, and then your principals as a superintendent. We all sort of approach things differently, and making sure that you're making it in the most accessible way really will help you.
Yeah. I mean, the many work streams of the superintendency never go away. Like, it's important, again, to teach your board about the multitude of work streams that exist. And you can only get better at some subset of those work streams in any given year, which goes to your point about the 3 goals idea. Yeah, I love that. And the combination of giving your board hard data accompanied by a narrative so that they can see how you're interpreting the result seems very wise.
Yeah. The last piece I was thinking about, the 360, initially, I also sort of just adopted a 360 without really considering what were the questions that were being asked. So I imagine, as you advise others, it's be really thoughtful about what do you want feedback on? I mean, you clearly can't avoid areas that that you might be struggling in. That doesn't mean to craft a 360 to only give you good information. But be really thoughtful about what it is you're asking, because you may not be getting exactly what you would hope to get out of a 360.
No question. I mean, ultimately, that 360 ought to be aligned with the competencies that you've agreed on with the board, and the subset of those competencies that are most related to the kind of feedback you can get from constituents. Yeah.